So, it's World War II. It's just ended and we have world peace. I'm kidding, of course, that's not the way it happened. We had a very cold war. And my guest today is none other than James Pelfry. He is an historian, writer, educator, pursuing to graduate and postgraduate studies in education in American history and religion. And welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
What got you interested in the Cold War and the Russian history in specifically?
The I think I over time I think it developed um organically. I think I would say I could say that. It's when you look at the history of modern Europe, you can't look at it in a context without the imprint of Soviet influence and the Cold War. Um, when World War II ended, as you sort of alluded to in your preface,
Right.
the concept and the idea was that we're finally going to be a world at peace, and quite the opposite happened. Quite the opposite happened, and it not only happened in Europe, it happened in China, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, throughout the entire world. So it was very, very um, uh, dark period, I think, in world history, because it really solidified a division between East and West. But it was certainly nothing new, and it was certainly nothing that anybody who knew the history of the Soviet Union in relation to the other nations that surrounded it, including the United States.
Do you think
Uh,
it's most of the West as well looked at Russia and the Soviet Union as this more backwards kind of culture and that you wanted to
well,
understand where it came from?
when okay, when at the I believe, and I think I'm one of few historians who really draw these parallels and pull them all together. Um, just like I believe that World War II was really an extension of World War One, I feel that the Cold War was really an extension and a continuation of uh, of um, I guess I would say international hatred toward the Soviet Union.
Right.
At the during World War One, the Tsar Nicholas II was losing badly. Millions of people died, and Lenin promised the Russian people that not only would he provide for them food and a redistribution of land, but he would immediately withdraw troops from the war. And he made good on his promise. Okay. But that left what would eventually become the Soviet Union, very isolated, because there were no friendly nations surrounding it. Um, and there were different philosophies that were coming up among the Russian revolutionaries. Trotsky had the idea of world revolution, while others were saying, let's build up Russia and the Soviet Union at this point to become a power so that we can dominate the world and overtake it with our philosophy. We saw communist insurrections in Germany before the Nazis took place. There were communist partisans during World War II that were fighting against the Nazis throughout Europe, and it really, the groundwork was really set, I believe, um, about 100 years ago, probably just even before the end of World War One.
Right. And that brings us to because they were allies. The U.S. and USSR were allies during the end of the World War II. And how did they decide to split Berlin and Germany when the war was
We were allies, but it was more of a practical element. So remember that Hitler was fighting a war on two fronts. He was fighting against he was trying to overtake Britain with the Battle of Britain, um, and consequently, or at the same time, had invaded the Soviet Union because they were basically had the idea of Lebensraum, living space, to expand their master
As you
race
well
for
know,
their
that
as right as a for for a Reich that was going to last for 1,000 years. And but Russia also had oil. Russia also had minerals and things that would help propel this war machine to its world's conquest. So um, when the when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, um, um, it was basically Britain and the Soviet Union who were fighting the Nazis. The United States didn't really, at the time, were still coming out of the Great Depression. We were still very isolationist in our foreign policy, and we were dragged into World War II by the declaration of war by Germany and by the attack at Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Japanese. The split of Germany happened after the end of World War II. And it basically, as allies, we were allies practically, but there was always tension between the British and the Americans and the Soviets, because Stalin had a very different idea of how Europe was going to look once the Nazis had surrendered. And he made that very clear during negotiations in Potsdam and Tehran with both Roosevelt and with Truman. And when the occupying forces came in to Germany, the whole concept was that they were only going to be there temporarily because Germany had experienced total defeat, total destruction. And the occupying forces, the British, United States, the Allies, were really there to support it from collapsing into absolute anarchy and chaos, even though it practically already had. Germany split only because, well, there were several reasons, but it was mostly because Stalin refused to relinquish his power over the eastern states. An invasion of the Soviet Union of that magnitude could never happen again, and would never happen again, at least not on his watch. And part of that was really practical for them to create that buffer. So if you ever were going to invade the Soviet Union from the west into the east, you had to go through occupied Germany, communist East Germany, communist Poland, and then into the Soviet Union, which of course it would be very, very difficult to accomplish at that point. So I think the friendship between the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II and post World War II was merely practical, but there was no way that those two ideologies could have ever really solidified anything very friendly for very long.
Right. And so that's starting to follow. But how then it comes to the nuclear, because as we will know, America bombs Japan with a nuclear bomb, and of course, Soviet Union wanted peace of the nuclear action. So how did USSR get spies in the nuclear program, and how did they manage to stay? So did they have their own scientists working on this, or did they just send KGB agents to America? Because there was quite a few agents there as well, if I remember.
There was a lot of international espionage for both sides. But the nuclear arms race really basically started because the Soviets and the United States knew that if Germany had ever gotten their hands on a nuclear weapon, they would use it.
Right.
Okay. How the Soviets and spies really got their hands on it is really open, I think, to discussion. I don't know that all of those official documents were ever really released. A lot of that is conjecture. Some would say that they had stolen it from the United States. Some say the United States had stolen it. Some say that they shared information among them to sort of isolate Germany, at least keeping it from them.
What is your theory about this?
Well, I would only be theorizing, but I think I would say that when I would say that the United States and the Soviet Union, in my opinion, just opinion, would have had to work together on that. Only because the mutual interest at the time was to keep weapons like that out of the hands of Germany.
Right.
Or the
If I
Nazis, I
remember
should say.
correctly, that Hitler wasn't really that interested in the nuclear program in the first place.
He wasn't. It's really kind of interesting to hear to say that, because there are instances in Nazi Germany where Hitler really tried to avoid using weapons of mass destruction, and ordered his generals not to use things like certain types of nerve gas, ricin, things like that had been developed for use in battle. And I don't know what really would be behind that. I think maybe the fact that he had been a victim of a gas attack himself during World War I, and maybe he knew how horrible it was. I don't know. That goes a little more in the psychology of Adolf Hitler, which would be an entirely different podcast.
Oh yes.
I don't think he had much interest in it, but I think if he knew it would bring up a speedy end or speedy surrender to Britain or to the United States, I don't know that he would not have used it.
Right.
So, I think if you look at Nazi history, it's really kind of hard to say this, but I really think their method of conquest was purely air and land. And I think they really got their pride from knowing that they did it by force and not by, bombastic weaponry of some kind,
And that brings us to the Korean War. So what was the reason for the Korean War, and why did both USSR and the US was interested in Korea in the first place?
Several reasons for the Korean War. And the Korean War, excuse me, is still being fought, if you ask me. Because, just a moment, please.
No worries. I mean, most of us should know the background, that they split the country in two and they wanted to reunite later.
Korean War, very good question. Kim Il-sung was a guerrilla fighter in the communist movement in Korea, fighting against the invading occupying forces of the Japanese. They were very nationalistic. They wanted to. One moment, please. I'm sorry. I'm losing my.
Okay, it's just having a little difficulties there, so we're just gonna. Yeah, we're. Yeah, there we go.
I have to drink my tea. Excuse me.
No worries.
When it was a very similar situation that we saw in Europe. Kim Il-sung, who was the first leader of North Korea, fought as a guerrilla, fought as a communist insurrectionary in Japanese occupied Korea, and they had been occupied by Japan for many years before that. During World War II and after the surrender of Japan, Korea was divided on the 38th parallel line between Soviet forces in the north and American and other allied forces in the south. The Soviets basically had administered the northern part, but only briefly, until they could find somebody that they would be able to trust to administer this in a way that would be satisfactory to both Soviets and later China. In 1950, the North invaded the South, crossed the 38th parallel, and basically conquered all of Korea. Well, by this time, the Cold War was completely frozen. Dialogue between the Soviet Union and the United States was basically
Distance.
yes, it was. I mean, it wasn't even in existence really at that point. In October of 1949, the Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China overthrew the nationalists and declared the People's Republic of China on the mainland. Okay, so the timing for Kim Il-sung's invasion of the South was not the best for everybody. Nobody really wanted another war like that. So instead of the United States, it was the United Nations that came in and under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur and pushed the the North Korean armies passed up the 39th parallel all the way up, I think, if I remember, toward the Yalu River near the border with China. Now, China was in the middle of a revolution and radical reforms and really couldn't afford another war after almost 3 decades of civil war within mainland China, and fighting and occupying force again Imperial Japan, but to have American and United Nations forces that close to their border was intolerable for Mao. So with a little bit of Mao's help and some aid from the Soviet Union at the time, the North Korean forces were able to beat back down United Nations forces back to the 38th parallel, where they basically signed an armistice that's been in place since then. So the war, nobody really surrendered in that war. Pyongyang, the capital, was completely leveled. It was a scorched earth, devastating, horrible outcome for the capital of North Korea. Everything that's in North Korea now was completely rebuilt after that. There was more tonnage dropped on Pyongyang than in the Allied air forces during World War II. Millions and millions of people died. Millions were left homeless and starving. And you still hear that in their diatribes, basically for public consumption. That, and when, even today in North Korea, when if a student is lucky enough to be in a school where they will be able to learn English, they learn British English and not American English, because it's, we're still we are, you're not, but we're still the arch enemy
Oh yeah, I get.
for them. Yeah, so it was very, and I think that was really, in my opinion, other than Vietnam, which is again another completely different podcast, that was one of the major in fact, that was the first proxy war between the Iron Curtain and the other nations. So it was really something to see. It forced the United States and Britain and France and the other nations of Western Europe to realize that as much as they didn't like the idea, that North Korea was going to be a fact, and definitely communist China was going to be a fact of life that they were going to have to deal with. Especially later when China developed their own nuclear weapon systems.
But do you believe that both for the democratic countries, both in Europe and especially America, that with the rise of Mao and both North Korea with Kim Il Sung, sorry, if I say his name wrong again, but do you think that the US feared that the rise of communism would be spread both throughout Asia and Europe?
I think they were afraid that it was going to be, yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And there's absolute evidence that the United States was very active at the time in undermining local elections, not only in Europe, but in other parts, in Latin America, the Caribbean, undermining free elections, putting in power their own strongmen. If somebody who happened to have some sort of left wing or anything good to say about the Soviet Union, they were very quick to work to have that individual replaced. We saw that in Chile with Salvador Allende, and then replaced with dictators who were just as bad, if not worse, than the communists that they were replacing. So, I mean, they used a lot of imagery about freedom and democracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but the democracy really wasn't there in a lot of cases. It took decades for South Korea to develop into what we would recognize as South Korea today. They had military coups, they had strong men that squashed free speech, broke up unions, all these different kinds of things.
With the end, and I was going to ask you this same, it's kind of the same question, but do you think that they fear that communism will rise in Japan as well, or do you think that they will?
Very much so. And I think when Japan, after 2 nuclear weapons, very much like Korea and Germany, were devastated. They were devastated, and they would have been very ripe for a communist insurrection. So when that government was being reformed, you see this in Western Europe too. It's interesting how and I don't want to get into any political commentary here because there's no place, but it's interesting that you see in Japan where they have free universal education for everybody. They have universal health care, things like that. Yes, and you see that in Western Europe too. The United States, the big boy in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, had no problem supporting social democratic politicians who could provide the things that the communists were saying that they were going to provide without being totally antagonistic toward American interests.
Right.
So we saw that in West Germany. Eventually, England had their own national health system, things like that, to provide for their people, to sort of put the lights out on these, communist and socialist parties, because they would have nothing really to agitate about.
Do you think that in a way saved democracy, the free healthcare system and free education?
I don't know that it saved. I don't know that it saved it. I'd say it was really a shot in the arm for it. I would say it would really assisted and eased that transition for people who were coming out of a very devastating and traumatizing first half of the entire 20th century. Was just war for Europe and for Asia. Of course, it goes further down, but I mean, nobody wanted to see anything like what you would eventually see happen in places like Cambodia or Laos,
Right.
where it was the governments just absolutely collapsed, and these communists, or in Africa, these communist movements came in and were just some of the most brutal dictatorships that we have known on record.
Of course, it's an episode as well. Cambodia is
Right. Absolutely.
Now I want to be, because we all seen James Bond and we all seen spy movies once or twice at least. So how Soviet Union had probably some of the most efficient spy projects in the world. So how did the KGB operate, and how did they manage to do so well? And I mean, if you read the book Deep Undercover by Jack Barsky, you get a little taste, which I highly recommend to read. It's a great book and really is a page turner. But how did the KGB operate, and how did they manage to be so efficient in and such a huge effect on the world?
Good question. And I think there's still remnants of the Soviet Union in Russia today. They still have an internal police.
I think they are still operational. Yeah.
I don't know that they're at the magnitude of what we would expect the KGB to be in our spy novels, James Bond or Hunt for Red October, those kinds of things. But when I think their mode of operation was really international over time. The framework for it was really built under Tsarist Russia. The Tsar had a secret police, and their goal was eventually what the KGB's goal was going to be, was to squash rebellion, to report any kind of political insurrections or agitators. They were a little more gentle, I think, than, if we could say that, than the KGB would eventually be. Because when somebody was, if you read the history of the Russian revolutionaries like Trotsky or Stalin, their exiles weren't really all that terrible. I mean, they were basically sent to Siberia, but they were allowed to read. If somebody could get out there and visit, they certainly had visitors, but there were the restrictions that you would later have in the Soviet prison complex. They were again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of those documents about the KGB still haven't really been released, but there is evidence.
We don't know why.
Right. Well, there's documents from every government that haven't been released. but I think how they worked, they certainly worked with communist movements within the United States. They did have some spies in place in government positions, and they were the most successful, other than squelching all internal political insurrection. They really were successful in their obtaining secrets of the United States and our nuclear program. So, I mean, during the Cold War, particularly during the 1950s and the 1960s, the KGB was very active in not just in internal infiltration within the Soviet Union itself, but external, and not just in their satellite nations like Poland or Hungary or Romania, but also in areas where there were either active communist revolutionary groups or potentially active communist revolutionary groups. And that's where the United States was very afraid of that, because we didn't want to have a situation in the United States where we were being undermined from within by, our archenemy in the Soviet Union. I don't think, looking at current events, I don't know that things are really entirely all that different. I do believe that Russia still has very active espionage interests throughout the world, and they have the technology to do it. So
I don't remember if it was a few years ago, but wasn't there a Russian politician who was killed, supposedly?
there were several. There were and a few Ukrainians.
Which supposedly is KGB.
Yes. And they do it. They still do it the old-fashioned way. They'll poison them with something that's tasteless, odorless, or whatever,
The umbrella, famous umbrella, of course.
and then slowly die. We still. I mean, for all intents and purposes, although officially the Cold War ended when the Soviet Union fell, there's still a lot of those remnants, particularly when you have, as president of Russia, a KGB man himself. So, like once a Marine, always a Marine. Once a KGB operative, you're always going to be a KGB operative. So I don't know that we've entirely gotten away from that. But I mean, they were very instrumental. They were very much like the CIA in a lot of ways. Of course, in the United States, there's a lot of sort of salving of the conscience of our country, in that we were justified in doing it to stem off the communist hordes and invasion and do it for democracy, when really they weren't doing it for democracy at all.
But yeah, that brings us to the death of Stalin in 1954, if I remember the year correctly.
Joseph Stalin died in,
I think
1953.
Right. And then
March of 1953.
Again, if I remember, I may be wrong on the name here. So Khrushchev takes over as dictator.
Nikita Khrushchev, he didn't take over right away. There was a little bit of a power struggle. And there was Georgy Malenkov briefly before Khrushchev took over. But because he was so linked to Stalin and Stalinism, he didn't last very long. In fact, if I want to say, that, yes, Malenkov, and then
But
and then it was Khrushchev. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead, please.
How does it Khrushchev again? I said may I say the name wrong?
Khrushchev.
Khrushchev. How does this affect the Cold War, both internal and external? His take on
Very, very. Khrushchev was very instrumental in changing the face of Soviet communism and communism throughout the world. And he inspired events that took place in many different nations well after he had been removed from office. When Khrushchev came to power as a Ukrainian communist party operative, not really the sharpest knife in the drawer, not the brightest guy there, but he was loyal and he would do what was asked of him, and he would do it right the first time. So when Stalin took notice of him, he eventually became a military decorated military officer during World War II, and was very well thought of by Joseph Stalin. But as with any politician within Stalinist Russia, or Stalin in the Soviet Union under Stalin, he of course always had to be on guard, because you never really knew when your time might be up. He survived the Great Purges. He survived the war, and then to really still have a position of influence within the Politburo shows that he was truly dedicated to it. When Stalin died at the next Communist Party Congress,
right,
Khrushchev gives a speech denouncing Stalin, denouncing Stalinism, naming his crimes, calling, and they went on a campaign of what was called de-Stalinization, where he was taken, although he still had some element of respect as having been, he wasn't elevated to that godlike status that he had before de-Stalinization, which was very frightening to establishment communists, because denouncing him undermined their power and their authority. And not only was that happening in the United States, it was being watched very closely by Mao Zedong in China, Kim Il-sung in North Korea. So as that de-Stalinization began to change the image of what Soviet communism is going to be like, it not only damaged relations with other Soviet or other communist countries, it weakened Khrushchev's position. Because if you're in position from your from the accomplishments of your predecessor, and your predecessor is undermined, then your accomplishments are undermined as well. That was an intolerable, again, another intolerable threat for Mao Zedong in China, and in Kim Il Sung in North Korea, who were not only working and striving to consolidate and hold on to their power, but to preserve their legacies within their nations. And from the de-Stalinization, we see relationships with, although the relationship with North Korea and China remained pretty friendly, relationships with the Soviet Union and with China completely broke down. So now we have not only one Soviet bloc of international communists, we now have it in two factions.
Right.
Those who would side with, Mao, or those who would side with the Soviets. And of course, the movements and things that sided with Mao were far more vicious than anything that would be seen by movements that were influenced and supported by the Soviet Union itself. So Stalin, when Stalin died, his legacy was firmly in place. And when Khrushchev takes over and denounces Stalin, then many felt that the legitimacy of the movement of international communism was now going to be undermined.
Right. So you consider this to be the start of the fall of the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin?
I believe that the beginning of the Soviet Union was the beginning of the fall of the Soviet Union, but I think this would be a very instrumental turning point, because what we see Khrushchev's removed from power in 1964. When Brezhnev takes over, it becomes a complete crony system, and they lack economic stability. They lack food. They're spending money throughout the world in proxy wars with the United States, in places like Angola, Cuba, and all throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. So, and they didn't really have the strength for very long to support that kind of communist imperialism. I get it's an oxymoron, of course, but they didn't really have the resources to support that kind of warfare. That sort of proxy warfare, instead of directly engaging the Soviet Union, which nobody wanted to do, give millions and millions and millions of dollars to another group to fight another group that's being supported by the Americans or the British or something like that. So,
and this brings us to the space race. And why was space race both important for the both of sides in the Cold War, and what effect did it have on the Cold War?
I think the space race, in looking at the space race, when Yuri Gagarin was the first to orbit the Earth, he was the first cosmonaut to orbit the Earth before the United States did. The United States really saw that. The Soviets saw it as a victory. The United States saw that as a they saw that as really a threat, because they didn't want to see any sort of communist expansion on Earth, let alone in space.
Right.
So, and if you can get up there, and they were developing at the time technology where they could actually have weapons that could be operated from satellites, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that really began when the space race in the United States, when President Kennedy was inaugurated. One of their major goals was to put a man on the moon. So not only are we, you want to orbit the Earth, well, we're going to put a man on the moon. Okay. And
Still find it kind of funny if the communists won and then you still see a communist flag on the moon today.
and I don't think they ever got back there to take it down, but to just to see that rivalry in every aspect of foreign policy is really, in my opinion, is very astounding. It's nothing like we've ever seen in world history before. It really isn't. It
Right.
really isn't.
This was more of a technological war rather than an
It was
war.
really it was a war on many different fronts. It's not only technological, it was nuclear, it was on the ground, it was hand to hand, it was verbal wars. Remember, Khrushchev was at the United Nations and took his shoes off and pounded his shoe on the podium that we're going to bury you. Khrushchev told Vice President Richard Nixon that your children will live under communism. Your grandchildren will live under communism.
Right.
So these are very real boasts. These are very real threats that he's making toward the Vice President of the United States. Of course, Nixon, the consummate Cold Warrior, later wrote that also a brilliant, in my opinion, a brilliant foreign policy observer. Later wrote that he couldn't imagine how deadly serious this man was. And when they, even later, the Secretary of State of the Nixon administration, when they were negotiating opening the doors with communist China for trade, said that they were subject to diatribes, anti-American diatribes, not only in the press, but in the actual diplomacy. We're doing this, but we're doing this under distress because you're still nothing but a bunch of an imperialist American pigs, and your system is going to fall, and we're the ones that are going to ultimately win, regardless of any treaties that we sign, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Were they right? Some economists say that China's economy is geared to surpass the United States within the next 2 or 3 years in growth.
And we see there's Chinese influence on Hollywood and in American media in general.
Absolutely, in technology. And, were they right? Were they wrong? I leave that up to, the pundits to hammer out between themselves. But they were very, very serious when they were saying things like this. Because again, if you're dealing with somebody who every day in the news is denounced as an imperialist, and then all of a sudden they're not an imperialist, you have your whole system is based on hatred toward that nation, and now they're friends all of a sudden. So that undermines your legitimacy as a nation. So, it would kind of like later Ronald Reagan would coin the phrase "trust but verify" in deals with, and he had no problems getting up and walking away from negotiations with the Soviets.
Didn't Ronald Reagan as well call the Soviet Union an evil empire?
Right. But they were still calling us, the imperialists, and we heard and by that time, radical Islam was becoming a problem in the Middle East.
Right.
So not only were trying to close in on the Soviets and communist influence, we now had this new problem of radical Islam terrorists starting in the Middle East, and Palestine Liberation Organization, the Ba'athist movement in Syria and Iraq, and then eventually what we saw with the Ayatollah in Iran. That again, these are subjects that we can talk about in later podcasts.
Of course, we will.
But yeah, I don't know how we got to that from the space race, but the space race really was a tool for the Soviets and the Americans to really assert not only their domination on the planet, but in the galaxy. So.
Right. Which kind of brings us to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and why did Castro want? So of course, this is Cuba is also going to be its own episode, but and so we don't have to go too much in Castro getting power. But why did Castro want missiles in Cuba, and how close were we to nuclear annihilation at the Cuban Missile Crisis?
I think we were closest to nuclear engagement with the Soviets at that point than we had ever been. And it was something that we had always wanted to avoid. But when Castro overthrew to really understand that, it's kind of, you have to sort of build up the groundwork a little bit behind Cuba and the Cuban Revolution itself. The dictator that Castro overthrew,
Batista.
yes, Fulgencio Batista, had been overthrown before. He wasn't well liked by his people, but he was well liked by the United States because he was a friendly government. He allowed businesses to come and do business.
The mafia was very well fond of him as well.
Mafia was very instrumental in that. During Prohibition, they were providing rum to bootleggers to bring into the United States, all kinds of fun stuff there. And he was a military officer doing this. So, and you see those kinds of relationships in nations like that between the United States and some of their military people. When that government finally collapsed to Fidel Castro at that point was not a declared communist. In fact, he had approached the United States for support.
A socialist, if I remember.
But he approached the United States for support, and those talks broke down under Eisenhower because they saw him as having overthrown an established friendly government in a pretty close nation, and they didn't really want. And he said, "Okay, well, you know what? There are other people that can help us get this off the ground." And then they established a relationship with the Soviet Union.
But he was dependent on the Soviet Union, right, for financial support and
quite dependent. They were never a very strong economy on their own. But the Bay of Pigs invasion was really what really ignited the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Again, I mentioned this on the podcast before, but do you think it come down to that if Cuba had industrialized, do you think they would be as dependent on the Soviet Union
No, I don't think they would have. I really don't think they would have been so dependent. I really don't.
You remember that they came from a sugar plantation and slave-based economy.
That's right. Very yes, very farm oriented, not a very wealthy nation. And as you said, it was all based on a very old um, uh, farm and labor system, crop rotation, and things like that. So no, if they were able to some sort of have developed some sort of um, industry, I don't think I think there would have been a very different um, out, turnout for Cuba.
Right.
Um, it's not to say that the I mean, of course, any kind of revolutionary is going to start with very high, lofty goals and freeing people and helping, bringing jobs and bringing education and modernizing healthcare, et cetera, or even having healthcare where there might not have been any in the first place. Um, but over time, it became the same old, communist
But again, we're getting
type of
off
things.
track here again, but let's get back to the Soviet missile crisis.
Soviet missile crisis.
Or Cuban missile
The
crisis.
question. So your question
Just wanted to
was
build up a little bit before we get into
the Cuban Missile Crisis happened because the Cubans really wanted to protect themselves from another attempt to overthrow their government. Um, the Soviets, being their friends, were willing to assist them and began shipping arms and shipping missiles to Cuba, which wouldn't have been much of an alert to anybody, except that Cuba is just about 90 miles off the coast of Florida, off the mainland United States,
yeah.
um, which was absolutely intolerable. So the United States had to respond, of course, with their ships,
Armenia,
and
right?
that's right. And it was major face off, and Soviets eventually backed down from it, but that really was the closest that the United States and the Soviet Union had in an actual face off, one on one, you know.
So what called it off? What called off the Cuban Missile Crisis in the first place?
What caused the Cuban Missile
What
Crisis?
called off? What
What
called it
called
off?
off the Cuban Missile Crisis? I think it was a game of chicken. I think both sides were ready to press a button, but nobody really wanted to be the one to do it first, and the Soviets just backed off and took their weapons and went back home. Um,
Provided
that
that the US did the same in Armenia.
Yes, and that it left an indelible stain on our relationship with Cuba, but it also provided decades of propaganda for the Cuban government. That we faced down the United States once we could do it again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So, um,
Do you think Castro would have used the bombs eventually if he's still?
no, I don't. I personally don't.
You think this would be a new North Korea situation?
Very much so. I think when you have governments like that may have weapons but have nothing else, they use that weaponry. And we've seen this several times in international diplomacy, but when they have weapons and nothing else, they use that weapon as their ace in the hole to sort of strong arm other countries or the United Nations for money or for food or for what. Okay, we'll dismantle it this time, but we really need food because our people are starving. So
it's like when we were kids who got the best toys and
right. Or even as adults, I've got the somebody comes in with the brand new 2020 Nissan Altima, and then their
Right.
neighbor has the 2021. Well, now
Who's the best?
right? Who's better now, right? So it's there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that in
Right. So I
history,
feel like there's a
particularly
lot of
communism.
childishness even in foreign diplomacy as well. I've got the best powers. I got the best news.
Childishness. I'd say human nature.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know.
Makes sense.
It's everybody's going to be looking. The Henry Kissinger said geopolitics is the linking of the entire world for our own self-interests. So every nation is going to be looking out for their own end of things. Okay. But so then they will be a little bit childish. Sometimes their history might not be as accurate as official history on certain events, and things like that, for them to get their point across. And that's not uncommon. That's definitely not uncommon at all.
Which, of course, this again, I say this a lot in this podcast because there's so many topics that we talked about now that just barely touch the surface. But the Vietnam War, we can talk a little bit about what triggered the Vietnam War and what, because it's kind of the same as North Korea in a sense. They were both communist and democracy state.
Yes.
They split it in two. And what kind of caused the triggered the Vietnam War?
Well, Vietnam happened. Well, the Vietnam War was inevitable at the end of World War II. The English had began to give up their colonies. The French wanted to go back to Indochina and conduct business as usual. Of course, that couldn't be the case. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Vietnamese communists. And you're right; it was a very similar situation as what we saw in Cuba and maybe even in Germany, where you had a Soviet backed up in the north, and then you had Americans or the beginning, the French really supporting
North Korea,
the South. Right. Oh, did I say Cuba? Excuse me.
Yes, you did.
North Korea. Excuse me.
That's fine.
We're talking about so many different
exactly,
places where all this other stuff happened. But when Ho Chi Minh, I think, spent a lot of time in his young years in France. He spent some time in the United States. He was very influenced by the United States in the American Revolution, the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, and their Constitution is basically plagiarized from Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think with that, there might have been some idea that they may have been able to sort of garner some support from the United States with that language. Of course, that wasn't the case. The French were trying desperately to hold on to their colonies in Southeast Asia, and in the post-war global political climate, it just wasn't possible. They were beat severely at the Battle of Bien Dien Phu, and at that point they knew that they just couldn't do it anymore.
As we hopefully learned by now, that colonization never works.
They couldn't. Well, maybe I hope so, but
it is so 18th century.
It's very, and even earlier than that. But when the French couldn't do it anymore, the United States began to step in, not by miles but by inches. With some advisors to help the South Vietnamese government. But these nationalist and American governments were so weak and so corrupt that they didn't survive. They went through multiple coups, and particularly one of our favorite leaders in South South Vietnam was Catholic. The Lon Nol was Catholic, and a predominantly Buddhist nation. So you already have that memory of imperialism and resentment from a predominantly Buddhist nation. So and they were fighting Vietnam, the North Vietnamese. They were fighting a guerrilla war that the West just didn't quite understand. And within hours, the bridges that we had bombed and devastated were being rebuilt. They were operating under these intricate tunnel systems through the North and the South. They had spies in the South, and insurrections in the South. When it became a real problem, things really escalated, was during the Tet Offensive, when the North Vietnamese just got the drop on American forces everywhere, and just about, we really weren't I don't think the United States was prepared for the kind of battle that we were getting into in Southeast Asia.
Right. Of course, I don't want to go too much into the Vietnam War, because this will be, again, as we talked about before, this will be its own episode, because it's such an big war that it needs. We could talk about hours of the Vietnam War and talk about
absolutely.
So,
But it was another. Let me just add this to it, and then we can move on to another one of your topics. Again, when you start to see these common themes throughout the Cold War, you have communists building or trying to build up something, and you see the United States interpreting them as a threat and having to react to it. And it was really a very frightful time, because especially if they had weapons, who's to say that they weren't going to allow their friendly nations to have some of these weapons? And I think that's what we were really trying to that policy of containment, just kind of keep corralling them, to prevent them from any kind of excess damage or unnecessary damage, fallout, if you want to put a pun in there.
We wish you will be back. I hope you will be back to discuss another episode of the Vietnam War eventually. And
definitely.
This brings us to the Berlin Wall in 1961. So why did they build? Because until now, the East Berliners had the ability to just go freely over to the West, but they realized that it was much better in the West than the East. So what was that? Some of the reasons that Soviet Union built the wall, because they wanted to keep them. Realize that democracy may have been better than communism.
They wanted to prevent free travel between East and West Berlin. People in East Berlin were, like you said, they were defecting, refusing to go back. And again, they wanted to not only limit that, but again, they wanted to assert their domination over the East, and the Soviet bloc and the Warsaw Pact nations. And I think the building of the Berlin Wall was instrumental for the Soviets to protect people from defecting to the West, but also to try to keep information from their realm to escaping into the West, so that people didn't really know what was going on over there. Part of their um, uh, um, policy was secrecy, so that they would always have the element of surprise. You know, the person with the most knowledge really had the most power. And if all of their secrets are being revealed by people who are going over to the West,
Right.
you know, that would have compromised their authority. So it was also very symbolic of the division between East and West. And it's not a very pleasant history to really think about, because, you know, one nation, one people of a common language who had just endured one of the most horrific periods of concentrated terror under the Third Reich, now have to deal with an even longer period of terror under Eastern communism. Yes.
Is it really? Is it right to say that families were torn apart, or is that more a myth than?
I would say that's absolutely true. I think that is absolutely true. Um, you know, the communists really throughout history have gotten a bad reputation, but it's I believe it's very well earned. I don't think there's a book called The Black Book of Communism that just basically gives you factual events of what was taking place in these nations, you know, and how many people, you know, were dead, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, there are some people, I mean, factually, if you look at the two greatest totalitarian movements of the 20th century, fascism and communism, if you lived under fascism and you sort of fit their ideal of what you were supposed to look like, and you were kind of quiet, and worked and didn't really cause any problems, in a lot of cases, you lived a pretty okay existence. I mean, if there was nothing for anyone to suspect, you know, you weren't a cause for any interest of, you know, under the Gestapo or anybody else. In the Soviet Union, everybody was a suspect. Nobody was safe. You know, there were, you know, instances where if Hitler had some disagreements with generals, many of them would be fired, you know, and they wouldn't work anymore. And in the Soviet Union, they were killed. So that's the difference here. That's
It's
the
disagree and it's a
difference.
dual for you, sir.
Right. Right. I don't say that at all to express any sympathy toward fascism or
Of course.
totalitarianism. There was just a little bit of a difference between it.
Right. And that I think brings us to the end. Why enter of Afghanistan, and why was the USSR interested in Afghanistan? Was there oil involved, or was there something else?
I think when the oil may have been part of it, but I don't think Afghanistan really has any you know, inherent minerals that are of really any use. They're a very poor country. And oil may, but the Soviet Union needed a foothold in the Middle East. Okay.
Right.
The Middle East nationalist movements, that were led by um, Nasser in Egypt, and eventually names that we've still hear recently, Assad in Syria, or um, Hussein in Iraq. While they may have been friendly to Soviet interests, they were not communists. In fact, communists were persecuted under their regimes. But so the Soviets needed a foothold in the Middle East because they saw that the United States had their footholds in the Middle East. Where else to begin than Afghanistan? Afghanistan's bordered there. Some of their people mix with each other, so they may even share a common language. They may share common traditions. It'll be easy. We'll just walk in and we'll take over. That was the beginning of the end, I believe, for the Soviet Union. They fought a war.
I thought it would be an easy win.
They did, but they weren't expecting. The thing about history is that if you don't know history, as as the old adage says, if you don't learn history, you're condemned to repeat it. And there have been many nations that have tried to enter into Afghanistan and came away with nothing. Great Britain was one of them. Soviet Union was another. United States is another.
Start to see a pattern here.
Yes, and there's a lot of mythology. I don't want to say mythology, but folklore behind them. So I don't know how true this is, but I certainly wouldn't put it past anybody like the Taliban to wipe out. They said they wiped out an entire regiment of British soldiers except one, and so that he could go back home and tell everybody what he saw there. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But Afghanistan not only was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, because they had no way to really finance that kind of an imperialistic campaign. It ignited the international terrorist movement that we know today. In fact, the United States supported the Mujahideen and against the Soviets, and one of those leaders was a young man by the name of Osama bin Laden, who worked with them to finance that. So it was the beginning of the end, although I think really the beginning of the end for the Soviets was far earlier. This was really their linchpin. This was their This was their Waterloo. This was their Little Bighorn. This was the event that was really going to undermine Soviet supremacy and eventually help to bankrupt them.
So why was, but just as you mentioned before, you said U.S. tried to enter Afghanistan, and you got Britain and now the Soviet Union as well. So why was Afghanistan this almost impossible nation to conquer?
I think traditionally, they're an independent minded people. They're very good fighters, and I just don't think when you go, you can't fight a conventional Western war with guerrilla, with people who are with a society that you know nothing of, with weapons that, I mean, they were being beat. I mean, they went in with tanks and Kalashnikov AK-47 assault rifles, and they were being beaten, and then their weapons were being taken from from them by the guerrillas, by the Afghanistan freedom fighters. And those were the same weapons that were being used against us in our fight against the Taliban to try to find Osama bin Laden after 9/11.
Right.
So, I think,
It was the spirit of the people.
it's the spirit of the people, and you can't fight a conventional war with somebody who's not going to fight conventionally.
Right.
It happened in Vietnam. It happened in Cambodia. It happened in Afghanistan. It happened throughout Africa. You just you can't. They're thinking in a different concept of warfare, and that's why they didn't win. That's why they didn't win.
Yeah.
It's a cultural difference that we just won't understand in the West.
So this brings us to 1989, and of course we have to mention this, as this is possibly one of the biggest events, one of the biggest events of the fall of Soviet Union, and it's definitely want to start the fall of the Berlin Wall. So, what point did people start to get tired of the Berlin Wall and tired of seeing that wall there? What made people realize that we don't want this here anymore? We want to tear it down.
Well, I believe that the people began to want to see the wall removed as soon as it was put up. But if to fast forward, let's say 20 years later, we have a man in power in the Soviet Union, a young political operative named Mikhail Gorbachev, who
was he the guy that gave them more freedom of press and more?
It was yes, glasnost, perestroika. He was loosening because the economy was devastated. The most prosperous part of the Soviet economy at that time was the black market. People were disenchanted. There was a campaign. The people were depressed. Spirits were broken. There was a campaign sponsored by the government to encourage people not to drink so much because alcohol consumption and alcoholism was such a problem. And Gorbachev was a committed communist, but he saw that the only way to preserve communism was to loosen it. More of a PR campaign. Hey, we aren't so bad.
Which of course would backfire.
Right, and he opened up. He had negotiations with Russia, with the United States. Excuse me. They began to the Soviet Union, while it was still a union, the independent Soviet states like the Ukraine and other countries were allowed an element of freedom to determine their own future and how they wanted to operate. And as you said, this sort of backfired on him because, as in the 50s, they said, if we allow the Soviets to take a foothold in the Middle East, it's going to cause a domino effect and everybody's going to become communist. Well, he sort of started his own domino effect, and by loosening restrictions and sort of opening things up for a little more protest, a little more free speech, limiting the power of the KGB, allowing people to trade freely for money and profit and things like that. Once they got just that little element of freedom that they had heard about, they wanted more. The problem is that half of Europe is under domination by the Soviet Union. So these countries were resistant to glasnost and perestroika. Moscow was losing control of these other nations. The communists in power were now the reactionaries toward it, and the people were just not going to take it anymore. So in 1989, I mean, since 1979, there'd been an insurrection, the Solidarity movement in Poland, which was run by Catholics, who had the support of the Pope, who was Polish, and an ardent anti-communist himself. So you see all of these pieces coming together, and
So it wasn't just financial reasons that crossed.
it was so when you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and I would encourage you and your listeners, go to YouTube or any other kind of video platform, and you can see what happened. Nicolae Ceausescu was one of the most feared dictators in all of Europe, and his last public speech, you can hear the audience railing at him and calling him a liar, calling him a murderer, and all this other stuff. So at that point, you can see this look on his face, like I've lost it. So, and within the next day, he and his wife were both summarily convicted and murdered, and a new government took over. To prevent that, a lot of the other communist leaders just sort of stepped down or took lesser roles, while reformers took over and dismantled the communist systems in their own country. It was relatively peaceful in places like Hungary, and other places, but Poland, um, I mean, it just sort of dominoed to where these countries collapsed, and it brought up new problems that would eventually come to the surface: ethnic rivalries, religious rivalries that they weren't allowed to express under a Soviet dictatorship. So it changed the world, and Mikhail Gorbachev, while a brilliant politician and very well intended, had really no intentions of relinquishing the hold of the Communist Party over Russia itself, but that's exactly what happened.
But
That's
doesn't
exactly
many Russians today consider him a coward, if I know it correctly?
I don't know how. I know that he spends the remaining years of his life in quiet obscurity. Every once in a while, he'll say something about environmental causes or peace, um, and accept an award or give a speech here and there. But I think he's relatively retired. I don't think. I don't know a lot of people from Russia or Russian nationals, but I suspect that the opinion of Boris Yeltsin isn't very high either.
And yeah, we're coming to an end, but I just want to talk a little bit about the aftermath in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union. What was it
Yes.
like to rebuild the economy, to rebuild the Russian Federation back to its glory?
I think it was very difficult. Russia has a history of being run by strongman leaders. I think that's in their tradition. Um, I think there's always been a desire to want to change that. Um, but so to see the rise of people like um, Vladimir Putin, I don't think should have been any surprise to anybody. He's certainly fits the mold of leadership that they've had. I think as far as opening up to free speech and free markets. I think that there was a period of time where they were very open to that, but I think now they sort of settled into their old traditions where press is allowed some freedom, but not a lot.
They say it's a freedom of speech, but it's not really freedom of speech.
Right. You know, they have freedom of religion, but do they really? You know what I mean? It's that kind of an element. I love Russia. I love Russian history. I love the Russian people. I
Language is
really
beautiful.
yes. And once COVID is at least contained, I plan on making a trip to Moscow very soon. So there's a lot there. I think it's mostly traditional. I think it's mostly cultural. I think they're yearning to breathe free, or how we would define freedom here in the Western, quote unquote democracies. But I don't think they're quite there yet, and I don't. I think they know that. Um, um, but I think that they know that there's also the potential for it to be there. So I have nothing but high hopes and aspirations for Russia and the other nations surrounding the Balkan states, the Ukraine, all of these,
Belarus.
Belarus, these nations that have always long struggled um, and haven't quite gotten um, their just desserts at the table.
Right.
So
But something I want to ask about, because we recently I found this again on YouTube, but is it true that Vladimir Putin now can be can more or less a dictator until or president until 2036, that they annulled the rule that he can?
I'm not sure how they're doing that now,
I heard something that he
because
has the possibility to stay on the
I
throne.
think he has the possibility to stay there as long as he wants to. Because remember, he had been president and then prime minister and then president again. Am I correct on that?
I think
If I
so, yeah.
remember correctly, yeah. So he's been, and even when he wasn't the president and the prime minister, he was the one pulling the strings. So I would say that that's probably a very safe number. I would expect him to even stay longer.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. He's basically a dictator at this point.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Is he the worst dictator that they've ever had?
Probably not.
Probably not, but I mean, it's that tradition, that strongman tradition,
Yeah.
and um, time will tell how that works out for the
I
Russian
think
people.
that's bringing the end to this podcast. A fantastic episode, if I may say so. And before you go, do you have anything you wish to promote, or social media you wish me to publish on the description?
I don't, but at this point, but I will tell your listeners that I am working on a book of historical fiction that talks about some of the issues that we were talking about, the end of World War II. So once that is completed, hopefully very soon, they will have the opportunity to purchase it or download it to their devices. So
Perfect.
very exciting.
This has been Well That Aged Well. My name is Erlend Hedegart, and we are also on Instagram and at Well That Aged Well. We are available every week, and next week we will talk about ancient Greece. So look forward, stay tuned for next week. And yeah, this has been a fantastic episode. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.